Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is one of a couple of lectures that will be part of a broader seminar series that I'm producing live in Denver throughout 2025 at Matter Bookstore down in downtown Denver and with my colleagues Rick Griffith and Deborah Johnson. So thank you for your support there. I won't be talking at all of the events, but the first two I am giving some grounding work, and I wanted to make my talks available in more detailed versions, both for people who want to revisit from the live events and for my Patreon subscribers. So this is for you, and thank you for your support. I'm going to share my screen here. We got started thinking about this in the wake of the 2024 election. And I was noticing people I would broadly identify as mainstream liberals in my community, feeling dejected and disappointed, and not really understanding the why the election went the way that it went, even though to some of us it wasn't exactly surprising. And then also to the disappointment that I see greatly among my high school and college students or university students. There's a lot of stuff to unpack here that I can't do all in one talk or one lecture. No, I don't think anyone can, but the idea is to create a community dialogue here in Denver for thinking about where we're at here in January of 2024. We have a new slash old president, right, who just came into took control of the White House this week. So that's the timing and the context here. My first talk in opening this 10-month series of lectures, of which only the first couple will appear on my Patreon page, um, is Liberalism, Neoliberalism, Identity and the Path Forward. And I'm going to give a very detailed version so because you can pause and stop or reflect. So I'm going to read out my long quotes here from my the authors that have inspired me. And this first one being from Sadia Hartman, and her book Scenes of Subjection, which is about slavery in the 19th century. Hartman writes, "The transition from slavery to freedom cannot adequately be represented as the triumph of liberty over domination, free will over coercion, or consent over compulsion. The valued precepts of liberalism provide an insufficient guide to understanding the event of emancipation. The ease with which sovereignty and submission and self-possession and servility are yoked is quite noteworthy. In fact, it leads us to wonder whether the insistent, disavowed, and sequestered production of subordination, the inequality enshrined by the sanctity of property, and the castigating universality of liberalism are all that emancipation proffers. Is not the free will of the individual measured precisely through the exercise of constraint and autonomy, determined by the capacity to participate in relations of exchange that only fetter and bind the subject? Does the esteemed will replace the barbaric whip or only act as its supplement? In light of these questions, the identity of the emancipated as rights bearer, free laborer, and calculable man must be considered in regard to the processes of domination, exploitation, and subjection rather than in the benighted terms that desperately strive to establish slavery as the, quote, prehistory of man." Now we begin with my words. A flurry of publications in recent years have argued over the presumed death of liberalism. Far-right thought has generally accepted liberalism as a thing of the past, even as they claim that, quote, liberal elites are their oligarchic enemies and that they now speak for the working classes. At the same time, mainstream liberals, social media, and the book publishing industrial complex have capitalized on identity politics through the target marketing of various categories initially intended to make democratic society more inclusive, yet resulting in the formation of identity silos full of cartoonishly abstract moralizing. At least part of the issue is the way that the phenomenon of neoliberalism has demanded that we reduce our qualified life to measurable outcomes, including our personal relationships and identities, our relationships with our students if we're teachers, definitely, while at the same time gutting education related to social issues under an ideology that society itself does not exist. If the entrepreneur was once the heroic symbol of innovation and creativity, we find ourselves today increasingly forced into a gig economy where we seek others to invest in us just to be able to survive. And the irony of me posting this on my Patreon account is not lost on me here. That this is the dark side of what has at times been optimistically termed mutual aid on the left. Critical theorists such as Wendy Brown argue that these conditions reveal neoliberalism's Frankenstein, a monster traceable to economic policies formulated in the 1930s and introduced in South America in the 1970s and the US in the 1980s, that have contributed to the rise of both anti-liberal and anti-democratic cultural conditions. Samuel Moyn has argued that earlier Cold War liberalism made concessions to social conservatism that enabled revanchism or revenge against civil rights gains of the 1960s and set the stage for the rise of the Christian right. Melinda Cooper has tracked how new social conservatism and neoliberalism worked together by focusing on the Fordist wage family as an ideal in a long history of instrumental control of women's bodies as reproductive sites and the racialized feminization of poverty, thus laying the ground for the deep-seated social rage visited regularly on women, especially single parent women, single women mothers, non-binary and transgendered people from both the left and the right today, um, but especially from the white Christian nationalists, this like deep-seated attack on queer folks, trans and non-binary folks. And we saw that in the inauguration speech last Monday, if just to put this into context. Amid the critical discourse, the re-election of Donald Trump, the establishment of a crypto advisory council, and the new office of crypto and AI czar all mark potential shifts in economic policy away from neoliberal policies without relenting on neoliberalism's gutting of the commons, privatization of public institutions, and the imposition of austerity measures on the poor. That's common neoliberalism. We might ask, if liberalism itself is dying, does that include its neoliberal incarnation? Why should people care? Well, I think at least one cause of the exhaustion and defeatism that mainstream liberals currently exhibit in the post-Harris campaign has been the mistaken view that they can put right wingers in their place by appealing to liberal democratic ideals, morals, and values, while assuming that working class people were either on their side automatically or, if not, ignorant bigots. Meanwhile, committed right wing thought, especially of the far right or alt right variety, has already declared and accepted that liberalism is dead, which makes liberal claims to respectability politics laughably outdated and irrelevant to them. My aim here tonight at the lecture, or wherever you are on the web, is to trace the liberal to neoliberal trajectory and why I think it matters in assessing where we're at as a society in 2025 in the United States, and why it matters both to our political comportment and our everyday lives, no matter how we may identify in terms of our party politics. So first, allow me an important caveat. Although there's a lot of theoretical work in what follows, I need to put a little bit of critical distance between myself and current traditional conceptions of the left, even if some of you consider this as a leftist face or have already decided because I'm into critical theory how radical or unradical I am based on my introduction. It often happens that people on the right just assume, like, I'm this radical, Roger's this radical leftist, or maybe to the radical leftist identifying people, I'm not radical enough or something like that. I ask you to give a little bit of pause for my critique. It is a friendly critique towards the left here. But committed leftist thought has too often attempted a completely overarching analysis that will explain everything. I believe this is largely due to a tradition of ideology critique within classic Marxism that became obscured with the rise of post-structuralism. Committed Marxists like Domenico Lacerdo and Gabriel Rockhill have critiqued recently what they call Western Marxism for caving to a theory industry largely relegated to academic elites. And while I understand their critique, it too easily, for me, resonates with an anti intellectual rhetoric among right wingers to destroy all public education. And that's very present and palpable, especially for those of us like me who are working in multiple public education contexts right now. Uh, so, in other words, it's not exactly my goal here to represent the left or the right or the center, nor do I believe that one at the same time can honestly claim a neutral stance. My second talk and our second event will focus on why I think the horizontal political metaphor of left and right is no longer adequate for the 21st century context, but that metaphor is, like neoliberalism, still with us and still present. I can't just completely jettison the horizontal left-right metaphor thing, just in the same way that I can't just say, like, I no longer believe in neoliberalism anymore. It's not a question of ideology, right? Um, so neoliberalism is still with us. And so in speaking on neoliberalism tonight or here in this lecture, I'm doing a bit of scaffolding for talks to follow. We should keep in mind that exhaustion is not merely something that current mainstream liberals or Harris supporters express. As big name leftist thinkers such as Boris Kagarlitsky and Nancy Fraser admit, neither the current progressive neoliberalism's claiming of the term left while advocating for or from identity silos, nor a traditionally leftist socialist conception of international workers and socialism currently provides a credible alternative to the current conditions. A little repetitive there. In other words, a lack of credible solutions on the left occurs not only as a far right charge that liberalism is dead, but among powerful minds who self-identify as leftist. So now let me turn to the phenomenon of neoliberalism. One of the famous taglines for neoliberalism is often associated with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. This acronym TINA, there is no alternative to capitalism. With respect to current neoliberalism, I think it's really important that we begin with some historical grounding so that we might more clearly understand how something like Trumpian economics, I'm using quotes there, both relies on and departs from neoliberalism, even while neoliberalism continues to act upon so much of our existence willy-nilly, and no matter how we articulate our political positions. In my view, and I'm also following Wendy Brown here, just to be clear and to give her credit, even the attempt to name something like Trumpian economics probably makes it sound more cohesive than it is. And again, that's why there is no analytical silver bullet as traditional leftist analyses attempted. Part of the peril that we face with growing precarity of late stage capitalism is that authoritarian leaders are enabled to make impulsive decisions that can surprise even those leaders' closest advisors. Classic fascism fully embraced that impulse in the name of the dictator or the Fuhrer as a cult leader capable of channeling the masses, whereas contemporary impulses towards right-wing authoritarianism, which are global and have been on the rise for half a century, and so much bigger than the phenomenon of the United States. For my audiences in the United States, I'm want us to. I'm suggesting that when we look at the bigger global picture, it might give us some different ways of thinking and languaging what's the phenomenon that we might have been that's been occurring for our individual experiences more recently or locally. Um, yeah, the global right-wing authoritarianism has been on the rise for half a century. Um, uh, it seems to indicate the decline of a nation state as a governing body amid shrill attention to patrolling the rise of nationalisms. Now, to unpack that, it's like, what do you mean? Like, we'll have like harsher border control. What I'm saying, and again, I'm following Wendy Brown a little bit here, but like, uh, uh, people drawing intense attention to policing borders is symptomatic of the larger condition of the disintegration of the nation state as an entity. That's a one possible way of reading that phenomenon. So it's a desperate attempt to cling to something of the past, right? And that's this sense, then um, the nation state is in a kind of transition, at least even if it's not going all the way away, right? So it's quite possible, for example, that Trumpism departs from neoliberalism's rejection of the state in order to create a government staffed by ideologues with the 2025 project. We might be seeing a transition of the state into a whole different kind of function. But whether or not, or I guess I should say, just so whether or not the nation state is in decline or not, whether you agree with me that I think that even if we're witnessing something new with Trump's sudden turn toward the crypto economy and libertarian tech billionaire piracy, I think we get a better handle on the situation by thinking about how we got here. So let's start with liberalism without the neoliberal element, or without the neo element. In its classic description, the term liberalism refers to a political system based on the premise that society is made up of individuals who have various rights, at least some of them considered to be naturally occurring or inalienable. We don't see it as a political party until the early 1800s, first to describe those more favorable to individual political freedoms, and quickly as the view that government ought to play a role in actions towards maintaining a social body or towards social change. The theory of liberalism is, of course, older, and it's developing in the 16th and 17th centuries. And we increasingly see that the explosion of Euro-Christian political theorizing was a direct reaction of those Euro-Christians rethinking their own history of the world after coming more regularly to encounter people of the two new continents. Right. So this is like a way of thinking about like all of the social and political change that's happening in so-called Western Europe in the 1500s and 1600s is in some ways a reaction to this whole shift in like the size or like what the how the planet exists, how the planet exists in space is the way it's been, you know, commonly lectured on in terms of like Galileo or the Copernican revolution or something like that. What I'm suggesting is that socially and politically, it is the encounter with two entire new continents, the peoples of those continents, and the resources that those continents might potentially have in the Euro-Christian's mind. Um, uh, that makes them have to rethink their own history. And in the rethinking of their own history, there's this revolution in political thinking, and liberalism emerges out of that context. So, as classic liberal theory goes, individuals enter society with one another by way of a social contract that establishes the consent of these individuals to be governed by a sovereign. Early, perhaps proto-liberal theorists of sovereignty, such as Niccolo Machiavelli, Jean Baudin, and Thomas Hobbes, all uh, commented heavily on the sovereign's approach to act as a religious leader and ultimate authority on interpreting scripture and establishing truth. So the idea that truth is made is a like Renaissance humanist formation, right? I want to just draw our attention to that in the so-called post-truth society. The concept of sovereignty maintains its contextual meaning within a specifically Euro-Christian milieu, whether Protestant or Catholic, Italian, French, or English, etc. Euro-Christian, always lowercase, always one word as an adjective here to describe not a faith, but something, a worldview, something deeper than culture. It's deeper than whether or not you're Protestant or Catholic or Anabaptist or some other splintered version of Christianity. It's deeper than the fact that you might be Italian or English and you might still be Christian or French, right? So Christian, a Euro-Christian, the theological disposition that is driving the political forces and economic forces in the early modern era cannot be distinguished from the Christian theological context underneath them. At that, there's no such thing as separation of church and state at this particular moment in history. And that's why I'm using this term Euro-Christian to talk about a worldview that persists into the current moment. So even when I call myself Euro-Christian and I say that's a better way of using the term white person, it's not to be derogatory towards myself or anything like that. I'm a Euro-Christian willy-nilly. But we need to unpack how the larger, deeper than culture, deeper than religious affiliation, and a sense of Protestant uh, notions of faith that like religion is something I believe in or assent to. I'm going for it in terms of worldview, which is beneath religious ideology, beneath culture, and something closer to language. The idea that truth is established by artifice coincided with the humanistic trend towards self-fashioning in the Renaissance and a projection of God as artificer. Of course, the Protestant Reformation brought to the forefront the idea of theorizing sovereignty itself and the right to rule, though we can see the aesthetics of this discussion in medieval ideas such as the king's two bodies, the king is dead, long live the king, the divine right to rule, etc. It is this shift towards theorizing sovereignty that we might call proto-liberal, despite the fact that, in retrospect, Thomas Hobbes is, of course, more authoritarian and John Locke, the so-called father of liberalism. It's why so many academics in recent years returned to the work of right-wing German legal theorist Carl Schmitt, also a Catholic, when we look back at the contours of early modern thinkers' discussions, we quickly see that they hinge upon interpretations of the nature of the soul and theological disagreements between Catholics and Calvinists, the idea of God as a divine author of the book of nature and the sovereign as the authorized interpreter of that book, which included the final say on scriptural interpretation as well as maker interpreter of human laws. This is part of why I insist on using the term Euro-Christian, including the replacement of Euro-Christian for what we colloquially refer to as white folks or white privilege, again, including myself. This has nothing to do with one's religious belief, and indeed, many Jewish intellectuals have operated in a context dominated by Euro-Christian worldview among Islamic intellectuals or atheist intellectuals, right? Talking worldview is a deeper thing. Modern racism, like modern political philosophy's concerns with the soul's salvation and liberty, is also premised on a Euro-Christian metaphysics or worldview. Part of what makes John Locke the so-called founder of classical liberalism is the emergent desire that nature itself is inherently good as the capital C creation of a divine author, but that it must be cultivated and extracted. And only Christians who, through their faith-based commitment to saving their own souls, had developed a civil society wherein true, quote, liberty might emerge. Nowhere is this thinking more tangibly realized than in Locke's labor theory of property, by which he conceived that the right to call land property was premised upon the improving it toward or for economic purposes, a process directly aligned with colonial extraction and emergent capitalism, while maintaining a Protestant and particularly Calvinist attention to works and individual salvation. The emphasis on individual salvation aligned with the emergent capitalism as a value placed on religious tolerance over state religion, which paralleled the capitalist revolt against mercantilism in the later 1700s and 1800s, and a nationalized economy monopolized by a strong sovereign. The new field of political economy, of course, emerged and sought to theorize this shift. I'm talking about Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Marx and so on and so forth. Sometimes we historicize liberalism as initially expressed negatively as freedom from tyranny and arbitrary incarceration without charges, due process, eventually moving towards a more positivistic view of freedom to or entitlements. So we move from like the Magna Carta version of liberation from incarceration or habeas corpus, who has the body if they've if the state has captured you in some sort of way, to a kind of freedom to flourish. When we do so, we move from the right to bodily autonomy, for example, and toward the right to an education, a right to housing, healthcare, clean water, etc., as all exhibited in the United Nations 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights. This distinction between negative freedom from a positive freedom is generally how I tend to distinguish between current libertarian perspectives and mainstream liberal ones. And both imply assumptions about what constitutes the so-called good life. Locke's formulation of the good life as life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was, of course, infamously reformulated in the American Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The substitution is important. So here, uh, property equals money, but property is inherently conceived as an abstract thing for extractive use by which we relate to land as a resource, just as property um, parallels the baptism of land in the same way it transfers the soul of a child or a sinner to a Euro-Christian God and Euro-Christian domination. And I emphasize the capital DOM there because the dominant, as the great scholar Stephen T. Newcomb has analyzed, the dominant is considered very much a good thing for Euro Christians, and like we think of that word domination today with a pejorative or a negative kind of connotation, but the dominant is a concept in Roman Catholicism of the period, that it's good for things to be controlled under Christ, right? Um, especially land. And if we can think about papal bulls, I have other lectures on papal bulls I'm not going to go into here. The concept of liberty and liberal philosophy works the same way. For classic liberals, such as John Stuart Mill, liberty was restricted to only those who had been cultivated within a particular social contract. Liberalism of the 19th century was largely involved with policies towards colonial extraction and the proper governing of the new political economies of the nation states after the Christian Peace of Westphalia in 1648. I know a more nuanced historical account of that, which I'm currently writing a book about, um, uh, um, uh, tells us that like it's not like the Peace of Westphalia ends all religious wars in Europe and especially in England, right? We can just point to England and the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s, right? Later theorists, especially after Rousseau, looked back to the Westphalian Peace of 1648, and it's become a kind of uh, a landing place for the ways that we think about the history of politics in the West. So the Enlightenment revolutions in America, Haiti, France, and Mexico ushered in a new model that embraced capitalism over mercantilism. Thus, the recently deceased Jamaican philosopher Charles Mills drew on gender critiques of a sexual contract by feminist scholars, implying the subordination of women to men in liberal society, or Euro-Christian worldview, and the racial contract that commodified black bodies. So Mills says that there's something about liberal society which is kind of inherently racist to begin with that commodifies black bodies through this thing called the racial contract, in the same way that that society had its own examined sexism that subordinates women in a particular way. Christian theologian Willie James Jennings offers a flip side view to the social contract with respect to African enslavement. Here, the displacement is part of a Euro-Christian worldview. So, with respect to an earlier or 1444 large-scale African slave market in Portugal, Jennings notes a semiotic conversion of the black body into market fungibility. Quote, Christianity will assimilate this pattern of displacement. Not just slave bodies, but displaced slave bodies will come to represent a natural state. From this position, they will be relocated into Christian identity. The backdrop of their existence will be, from this moment, the market. End quote. And I think Jennings is somebody a scholar I admire greatly, and uh, really points to that positioning of Black life within the context of the market from the 1400s on. Even that's happening even before Columbus's voyages of about 50 years later or so. As well. So we can see the larger formation and the displacement of the body that becomes African slave. Liberal ideology has often obscured and conflated the notions of freedom and liberty. When we analyze it closely, the freedoms that come with liberty are premised on entering that social contract, which is why no native people following buffaloes on the plains were considered free according to liberalism, and why John Locke's labor theory of property became a rationale for Indian removal. Including from John Locke, right? Who never visits Georgia or anything, but he has all sorts of things to say about what constitutes the improvement of land. So even when we look to the Southeast and the so-called five, quote, civilized tribes attempted to embrace new regimes by farming, writing their own constitutions, converting to Christianity, developing their own writing systems, as the Cherokee did. Like, it doesn't matter to the concept of liberty as it's embedded within the Euro-Christian context, itself. So the emergent discourse on race developed first from a distinction between Christians and non-Christians, and toward a legal conception of capital W whiteness and white supremacy as a way to prevent indigenous peoples and African slaves from becoming full citizens within the political economy, because the success of the political economy depended on their exploitation. The status shift from slave to non-slave was more economic than moral, despite abolitionist activism. As Lisa Lowe notes with respect to her argument that abolitionist ideology did not free the slaves, she writes, quote, by liberty, John Stuart Mill did not mean the narrower ideas of individual right or free will, but rather liberty was the overarching principle that both defined political sovereignty in liberal society and which authorized the differentiated power of government over, quote, backward peoples. Mill stated in on Liberty that, and so this is we're quoting Mill here. This doctrine is only meant to apply to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. We are not speaking of children. We may leave out consideration of those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered in its non-age. End quote. Here, it's important to contextualize the idea of these, quote, non-aged peoples against the social progressivism inherent to liberalism. To the extent that liberalism is more, quote, inclusive of any group, its politics of recognition are self serving in the same way that extractive capitalism is premised in the idea of a return on investments into the supposed, quote, free gifts of nature as, with a capital N as God's gift to those deemed worthy enough to be saved. This is why laziness is formulated among Euro Christians as sinful well beyond Max Weber's articulation in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. To deny capitalist extraction in such logic is to deny God's grace by overtly neglecting what's needed to, quote, save yourself. This is why right wing people will, on the one hand, impose austerity measures onto the poor, right? Um, uh, uh, Villainize the poor as rapists or lawless individuals, people who don't want to work. Well, at the same time, last Monday in the inauguration speech, someone like Donald Trump could say, "We're going to drill, drill, drill," or I can't remember the exact phrase that he uses. Like he's like, "We're going to open up all of the land, all of Alaska to oil, and we're going to use that oil." And so it's all part of the same underlying kind of worldview. And it might be scary to you all, but what I'm trying to say here is that even that we see might maybe a revanchist right wing or white Christian nationalist version of it that's very kind of in your face, but there's a deeper sense that that worldview is supporting concepts of liberalism and neoliberalism itself. So as you can see, I'm quickly aligning my analysis of liberalism with its corresponding religious expressions in a Euro Christian worldview. Marx and his followers distinguished between the base structure and the superstructure, in which the base structure denoted the means of production and superstructure denoted the ideological conditions supporting it in a kind of feedback loop. Thus, for both early and some contemporary Marxists, quote, religion is something relegated to a condition of ideology. Ideology critique became the method for Marxian thinkers to unmask what was truly at stake in the material economic conditions. My take is different than that, right? I do not relegate what I'm calling Euro-Christian worldview to the idea of religion as if religion is a piece that fits into an ideological superstructure. It's worldview which is beneath culture for me, right? Just to distinguish myself from the Marxian thinkers here. That said, today we are well aware of the correspondences between the rejection of religion and state communism of the 20th century and the ire it inspired among religious conservatives in the US who coalesced a reactionary identity against so-called godless communism. We're also aware that state communism of the 20th century employed numerous analyses and departures from what Marx actually wrote. I have no interest here in rehashing Cold War doctrinal differences between East and West. I simply note that few Americans today ever read Marx, and even fewer understand him in any depth. Yet almost every American today, and especially my university students, feels entitled to make claims about Marx or Freud or name the other intellectual who's oftentimes assigned Jewish status, whether or not to extent the religion of Judaism, right, like plays a role in their lives, and that's a case in point, right? That's like is like the animosity poured on these thinkers by right wingers in casting them as Jew actually had nothing to do with a religious conception, but it had everything to do with a racialized formation of Jewish people that was present in the anti-Semitism of 19th and early 20th century Europe. So it's of course part of the neoliberal fabric today to assume that there's no alternative to capitalism, just as neoliberalism takes all latent content from the unconscious and makes it manifest by way of market surveillance. Probably need a deeper analysis of that. But it's a long something I've thought for a long time is that that's one of the agendas of neoliberalism, and these computers and our cookies feeds is actually that desire our that point out our desires before we even are aware that we desire them. It's part of like making the unconscious manifest. Um, certainly, I've just like been kind of critiquing the kind of mainstream Americans who don't read Marx or whatever. But certainly the same thing could be said about far right wingers. Like most Americans don't read Alain de Benoist, for example. But the lack of awareness of right wing ideology among Americans contributes to many Americans being implicitly swayed by far right politics without recognizing those shifts as historically aligning with the end of the Cold War. So here I simply point again to the reelection of Trump and the widespread confusion over charges of fascism in recent American politics. Indeed, most Trump supporters, which includes most of my family, my 8 siblings, their 20 plus children, their spouses, in no way consider themselves to be supporters of fascism or authoritarianism. As the conventional articulations go, some of them are free thinkers. And of course, their free thinking includes anti-vaccination rhetoric, including the idea that HIV/AIDS was created by the government. This kind of thinking is an abstract and specifically anti-liberal notion of freedom that downplays its own liberal privilege to say that the social contract doesn't apply to them because liberalism is itself corrupt. This produces a kind of don't tread on me notion of freedom, entirely resistant to having social privileges pointed out. So many embrace libertarian positions without necessarily considering themselves to be right wing, yet they lament the so called woke left and wax exuberant in denouncing transgender folks, the New York Times, and quote liberal elites as fascist by aligning governmental policies with social control. We should remember, however, that classic liberalism emerged with the assumption that good governance necessitated attention to the health of the body politic. Public schooling, census reports, police departments, racialized science, and eugenics, as they emerged in the 1800s, were all part of this. And this is what Michel Foucault later called biopolitics in his lectures, where he's, actually the first talking about neoliberalism in the late 70s. The late Noam Chomsky productively described neoliberalism as a shift from the gold standard toward an economy based on finance capital and debt credit relationships, while liberal capitalists of the 19th century tended to hold the view that wealth ought to be reinvested in society by way of civic centers, public parks, and education, like Carnegie Hall. You can think about that. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, sees wealth accumulation as a zero-sum game with no responsibility on the part of the winner to give back, whether in the form of taxes or philanthropy. So neoliberalism has come to shape so much of our everyday comportment, even if we do not realize that this is the case. It is not a matter of choice or belief or something that you'd simply identify your way out of. Again, I'm going to say that again and again and again. It's not a matter of choice or belief or something that you simply identify your way out of. In slight contrast to Chomsky's description, Wendy Brown and Melinda Cooper note that neoliberalism is also much more than a set of economic policies. Feminist theorists like Nancy Fraser similarly teach us that capitalism is a way more than a set of abstract economic policies and instead a holistic articulation of human relations. We often hear constructions such as, quote, neoliberalism is capitalism on steroids, but Wendy Brown draws our attention to the implicit values assumed by the architects of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism here is a form of what Michel Foucault called governmentality, or the conduct of conduct. We have to connect neoliberalism's economic focus to its effects on culture and its implicit values. If we're looking at the history to understand how we got here to be today, right? So let's look at neoliberalism's origins in the late 1930s. Wendy Brown traces its roots as a theoretical third way between right-wing Nazism and Soviet Russia. Friedrich von Hayek, an early Austrian neoliberal theorist who relocated to the United States, advocated for a reinvigorated notion of liberalism as providing that third way between Soviet socialism and Nazism. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Milton Friedman, who'd been working on this since the 1940s, had a long career before he wins the Nobel Prize in the 1970s. So throughout the 1970s and 80s, Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics had a significant influence on Nixon, Carter, and Reagan administrations, as well as Clinton. The Chicago Boys, as they were called, tested neoliberal policies in Chile after the US-backed coup murdered the democratically elected Allende and installed the dictator Pinochet. The policies of free trade, especially internationally, privatization of all public companies, a shock doctrine as it's come to be known, that initially hurts the economy but then supposedly helps the economy in the longer picture. That's part of the neoliberal economic model and policy in action, right? Ronald Reagan's adherence to this came in the form of trickle-down economics, which of course assumes that the ultra wealthy will, quote, naturally choose to spend their wealth to improve society. So even though Reagan is a Republican and he's very conservative, those values that he has are actually in some ways classic liberal values, right, from the 19th century. Brown has importantly shown that earlier implementers of neoliberalism, such as Reagan and Thatcher, bought into a set of values presumed by early neoliberalism. Um, uh, Melinda Cooper notes that the new social conservatism that would produce the culture wars during the 1980s was not simply a reaction to New Deal Keynesianism or a welfare state, which is the way it's commonly thought, but it's a reaction to the expansion of those welfare options in the 1960s, especially to African American women following the Moynihan Report, which is developed under Lyndon B. Johnson in the War on Poverty. The New Deal welfare policies had discriminated against unwed women, and Southern states had blocked welfare to Black women during segregation, claiming their domestic work was essential labor. So, of course, this is the stereotypical conception that what the proper work for Black women is domestic labor. Um, by the 60s, with the end of segregation and a report on the rise of single Black mothers advocating for more jobs for Black men so that they could be included into a Fordist wage earning family, was initially accepted by white liberals, despite criticism from African Americans from the beginning of the Moynihan Report that it was stereotyping African American life, right? Cooper notes that Trotskyist leftists um, eventually embraced what is now called new conservatism of the 1980s on the idea that welfare programs destroyed the family by helping unwed women with bad morals, the very stereotype of the welfare queen that Reagan used to gain massive political support as governor of California in the late 1970s. Neoliberals had long hated Keynesian welfare state, but they now had new moral alliance with the former leftists who claimed New Deal wage labor based on a sexual division was being destroyed, while paleoconservatives who wanted to return to segregation era society wanted revenge on the civil rights movements of the 60s. So it's at this moment in the late 70s, early 80s, where the feminization of poverty intersects with racist and sexist resentment toward expanded civil rights. But the critique of a moral decline in society could easily be applied to gay people associated with AIDS and anything that appeared contrary to Christian values. From Satanic Panic to MTV and explicit advisory, um, labels on album covers, right? The rise of Christian right emerged as resentment of government involvement in desegregating Christian schools, with the IRS refusing to grant tax exemptions to private nonprofits in violation of equal protection, and a concerted effort to unify a religious coalition based on the controlling women's reproductive rights. Abortion, right? The policy of abortion is uniting all of these different forms of revenge against welfare expansion and civil rights expansion in the 60s. And we've got to see it in that context and the way all and run that through to Dobbs in the same way that we have to see the dismantling of the IRS, the hatred of the IRS and taxation as not just being like the government is trying to take too much of my money, but the government is trying to tell me not to tell our institutions that are religious and racist that they cannot be racist anymore, that they must integrate, right? So it's the government telling uh, uh, the religious institutions what they ought to do. Hence, the formation of a Christian right emerges, very expansive, lots of 40 plus year long smart grassroots organizing. You have to give them credit even if you don't align with their policies. No, of course, I think that the new emergence of white Christian nationalism, I would say, is a different tweak of that older version of the Christian right, but nevertheless is of that lineage. Margaret Thatcher. So, moving on from abortion for a second here, Margaret Thatcher is often credited with two redacted phrases fundamental to neoliberal principles that, while introduced into policy in the 1980s, took a more explicit expression during the 2010s. First, again, there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. That's Margaret Thatcher's quote. Second, and to repeat again, which I've said a number of times now, there's no alternative to liberal capitalism, often shorted to that acronym TINA. So when we look more closely at the context for the first phrase, the above, though, we can glean an implicit assumption of Euro-Christian values based on the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. So what I'm saying is that neoliberalism, which oftentimes seems like it has no values, um, uh, is not theorized initially by or implemented by people without a sense of values attached. As Wendy Brown says, it becomes a kind of Frankenstein, and the anti-liberalism and the anti-democratic tendencies are the result, the unintended, if you will, result of the early neoliberal thinkers. So let's look at the full paragraph from Thatcher's 1987 interview. It's fascinating. She says, quote, I think that we've gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, quote, I have a problem. It is the government's job to cope with it. Or I have a problem. I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless. The government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women and their families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to help look after our neighbor, and life as a reciprocal business. And people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations, because there is no such thing as an entitlement unless someone has first met an obligation. And it is, I think, one of the tragedies in which many of the benefits we give, which were meant to reassure people that they were sick, if they were sick or ill, there was a safety net and there was help, that many of the benefits which were meant to help people uh, um, who were unfortunate, quote, it's all right. We join together and we have these insurance schemes to look after it. That was the objective, but somehow there are some people who have been manipulating the system. And so some of those help and benefits that were meant to say to people, all right, if you cannot get a job, you shall have a basic standard of living. But when people come and say, but what is the point of working? I can get as much on the dole. You say, look, it's not from the dole, it's from your neighbor who's supplying it. And if you can earn your own living, then you really have a duty to do it, and you will feel very much better. End quote. Margaret Thatcher, if you're just listening to this like a podcast. This is, of course, a politics of blaming and shaming the unemployed, but it remains a values-based logic, even a Christian values-based logic. I think it's pretty easy to see in the neighborly thing there. In this logic, some people have manipulated the system that was otherwise set up with good intentions to help those less fortunate. Society does not exist, and the government is the implicit victim being taken advantage of at the neighbor's expense. So, as Wendy Brown and Melinda Cooper teach us, these political leaders implementing their neoliberal policies were indeed acting out of what they saw as Christian values, values being of being a good neighbor and an emphasis on the dual-parented, implicitly heterosexual nuclear family who were thus associated with national stability. The libertarian turn towards anarcho-capitalism in some of Donald Trump's recent moves, and definitely among his advisors, do seem to have embraced a delinking of capture capital from social conservatism, even while the Project 2025 folks and JD Vance express radicalized versions of family values. And who might we say are their true enemies? Even more than relegating to Kamala Harris to the old quote Jezebel stereotype of the welfare queen, mixed with the idea that she was somehow slept her way to the top with Jerry Brown and aspirations to power associated with feminism. It is, I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to even like articulate that, except that it's out there in the world. And so, like, my respectful apologies to Harris or to any woman who's um, uh, fallen under this stereotype, right? But even more than that stereotype, it is the people whose existence that obscures the racial and sexual distinctions that attract the ire of the bro Rogan types who claim to be blue collar. At one time, even supporting Bernie Sanders. If you look back to Joe Rogan, I'm kind of picking on him here. Um, uh, um, and the reinvigorated religious conservatives here. There's something. What I'm saying here is that there's something more, more even so than the respectability politics around and racist and sexist politics and stance against politician like Harris. It's really um the people, the folks who obscure. It is the people whose existence obscures the racial and sexual distinctions that attract the ire of bro Rogan types who claim to be blue collar, at one time even supporting Bernie Sanders, and the reinvigorated religious conservatives who, after the doctrines such as Rodney Dreher's Benedict option, see more in common with Islamists than with a so-called liberal society that has become so morally corrupt, it's not even worth saving. But what kind of blinders were mainstream liberals wearing when they thought that Harris could win based on their own inclusivist morality while completely rejecting the economic concerns of the majority of the nation during a time of intense inflation? And I think Bernie Sanders is very much correct in that assessment there. But the unfortunate thing about the current slippage towards right wing values has a bunch of young, especially white masculine men, or white men turning towards like a revenge version of masculinity based on this because and part of that revenge is being taken out on non-binary and transgendered folks, queer folks in general. Um, uh, So we only need to look back at the inflation crises of the 1970s to see that it was that very situation that produced the stereotype of the welfare queen, racialized as women of color, and a perception that wealthy people and corporations were paying more than their fair share to support moral decline. Why is the discourse about transgender kids seeking surgical procedures or even adult trans folks wanting uh, uh, medical coverage so maligned today, right? Um, I believe that if we really want to, unpack the longer history of it, it's because it taps into the very root where economic policies continue to do the racialized biopolitical police work and sexist, right? Police work of regulating women's bodies. Um, uh, they are affectively part of the same kind of contingents, and that this is like why I think Wendy Brown's thinking and Melinda Cooper's thinking is so helpful for us because if we only tap into, as Brown says, like to looking at neoliberal governmentality as a kind of form of rationality without taking the values and the affective conditions that come along with it into consideration, then we're missing a big part of the picture. And if we are able to see that picture and we're able to see like um, uh, how, for example, in the example I just used a minute ago, this is not the only example to use like younger white men's like MMA, um, mixed martial arts interests in reclaiming their masculinity or fighting the power, which is like a breeding ground for alt-right kind of stuff. That cultural impulse of when a white student in a class this week, in a U.S. history class, like day one, is saying that he's feeling personally attacked because of his whiteness. Um, like like there's you could be the take the Hillary Clinton route there and say this is a deplorable person, or you could take the educator's route, which like that's my job, to like be like, well, let's unpack this. Let's there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of unconscious stuff going in to that feeling of resentment. And yes, do people of color who've been facing discrimination on the basis of so-called race, like been dealing with it for much longer, yeah, and they resent the kind of privilege that a white male person has that's confronting this in a really strange way, and with inadequate education around it. Is that resentful too? Yeah, that's like totally understandable. But if we connect it back to the economic conditions that are driving so many people among working classes to austerity measures, to debt, like like uh, unrecoverable debt, that drives us towards a kind of survival based thinking. Uh, and that's part of the Frankenstein project of neoliberalism, that is being challenged and reconfigured in certain ways by the incoming um, folks in the cabinet of the current White House in the United States. I'm going to stop there. I have a lot more to say about these kinds of topics. I've got some discussion questions for folks here to think about. We might think about like, do unjust conditions present present in classic liberalism and radicalized neoliberalism signaled the entire project's bankruptcy? That might be one thing that's like, and I think that this would be the truly radical left's sort of take, right? Is like liberalism itself has always been corrupt, um and including and neoliberalism with it. It's just this kind of radicalized, extremized version. Is there something salvageable? And I think that this is what a lot of writers like Samuel Moyn, who I mentioned earlier, like people are trying to figure out, is there something recoverable there? Um, Wendy Brown is advocating for something. I think she's writing a book on it right now called Reparative Democracy, and you will have to look into her for a more precise articulation of that. Um, what second question, what happens if we see the forces of neoliberalism and capitalism not so much as ideologies, but as religious in the older sense of the word, not in the Protestant sense of I believe and I publicly avow and I've just like done this conversion ceremony or something like that, but in the older sense of religion as a kind of binding that can't be done away with by simply saying, I don't believe that or I reject that. Um, and here I would look to a former colleague of mine, Carl Raschke's work at University of Denver, who I agree with him on this take on that neoliberalism is really speaking to something that binds us, and we're under the conditions in the same way that global capitalism subordinates pe all people in the world in some way or another to its regime. Three, how do we maintain relations with one another without receding into identity silos? That's probably a familiar question that we've been coming up with. And here I would say, like, I tend as I used the word maybe once in what was previous. I tend to steer away from the use of the word woke, although people like Ron DeSantis use it over and over again intentionally in their speeches to charge up their political base. Um, I don't feel like what is kind of happening in those movements where traditional liberals are charging folks who are identifying as being on the left as fascist, that kind of phenomenon. I what I would say is actually those people that are claiming to be on the left have a conception of their leftism that is so informed by neoliberalism that they have lost sight of what might be um, uh, 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 a, a more robust conception of what that could be. That's not for me just being utopic. I'm being more pedagogical or I'm being more polemic there. And I'm saying that I think it's better to think of that phenomenon that well, like I want to admit that it is a phenomenon like on university campuses and stuff where there's almost like a tyrannical type of control. And I want to see that in a different light in the way that like somebody who's been traumatized intergenerationally, we might think about like people who've been hurt and hurt over and over again. Well, coming out of that hurt, there are all sorts of violent actions that come out of that, like that ought to be approached from a position of if we're thinking about ourselves in community with each other, of finding ways to care for each other. And I don't mean that in a hippie sense. I mean that this is part of what we're being asked to do is to find a deep commitment to what it means to care for one another, um, despite like differences and despite uh, um, centuries of um, inequity, right? Like I do feel like that we need to address the centuries of inequity, and so that we might understand, right? As my native friends say, we can't have reconciliation without conciliation. If there was never conciliation to begin with, you can't be jumping straight to talking about reconciliation. Um, and that this is, I think, something this is a challenge for those of us, especially in public schools right now. It's a challenge with our kids. It's a challenge with our students who are getting as much information from the way algorithms of TikTok or other social media. And it is our job as educators and as adults and I think as democratic citizens to find a notion and of caring that can address this. And I'm going to end this talk there, and hopefully I provided some food for thought um, uh, and discussion for you and folks among you. For people wanting to interact with me individually, I have to do this stuff for a living. So you can visit my website, ccctheory.org, or support me on Patreon and contact me there. But I can't just have long, um, interesting conversations without attending to my own survival needs in this economy that I've just described here as well. Thank you for your support and for your attention whenever and wherever you are. Have a good day, night, morning.